Here, we'll work with gradients. A gradient is just a graduated blend of two or more colors, and it always includes a starting color and an ending color. And you can create different types of gradient fills in Illustrator, including linear, which the beginning color blends into the ending color along a line, and radial, in which the beginning color radiates outward from the center point to the ending color. So let's start working with our gradients. I have my gradient panel open here. I'm going to select that green background shape. And then in the fill color, I'll click the black-white gradient in the swatches panel. There it is. And it filled it with a linear black to white gradient. So now we'll work on editing the gradient. And make sure that the fill box is selected in the gradient panel. And I'll double-click the white leftmost gradient stop, which will bring up our swatches panel. And I'll click to select the light brown swatch named BG 10%. There's BG, and then the one just to the right is the 10% tint. So I'll just click on that. And our gradient has changed a little bit. Now I'll double click the black color stop on the right of the gradient to bring up the swatches panel. And I'll make sure that the color panel is open. So I'll just click on that icon that looks like a palette to switch to the color panel. And I'll change the CMYK values to a C of 25, an M of 25, a Y of 25, and a K of 0. And there our gradient has changed to a more subtle gradient. Now we want to save this gradient that we just created. So in the gradient panel, I'm going to click the gradient menu area to the left of the word type, and then I'll click the Add to Swatches button at the bottom of the panel that opens up. And there's the little icon way at the bottom underneath the gradient swatches. And there we can see it's added it to our swatches panel. And now I'll just double click that new gradient swatch 1 thumbnail to open the swatch options dialog box, and I'll rename it background. There's my swatch options dialog box, and I'll just rename it background. And we can see if I hover my cursor over that, the tooltip now shows that it's named background. Now I'll click the Show Swatch Kinds menu button at the bottom of the swatches panel, and I'll just choose to show the gradient swatches. So there are the gradient swatches there. I'll choose a few of those to fill that background just to see how they look. There's an orange to yellow, blue to white, but I'll finish with that gradient that we just created called background. Now we can adjust the direction and angle of our gradient. So I'm going to double click the background gradient shape to enter isolation mode so that we can just work on that. And then I'll get the gradient tool in the tools panel. Just click that on and it shows us the gradient annotator, which is kind of like a version of what we see in the gradient panel. We have the left stop and the right stop on there. We can adjust them on the gradient annotator just like we can in the gradient panel. I'm going to hold down Shift and start at the top of the shape and drag down, and that will change the direction of the gradient. Let's see, I'll drag from top to bottom, and you can see how it changed the direction of the gradient panel. I somehow exited isolation mode. I'll go back to there. And then we can also move the gradient around as we want to. If I hover my cursor towards the bottom of the annotator, we can see a little circular icon appears, and I can just move that as I wish. I can also move the gradient annotator around to adjust the gradient as it fills the object. And there I can move the angle of the gradient just by moving that endpoint. I can also change the angle of the gradient in the gradient panel. I'll enter 60 degrees there, and that moves it over a little bit, but I think I'll change it back to -60, and that will change the gradient to the other direction. And now I'll go ahead and lock the background. So I'll go to Object, Lock, and choose Selection so that we don't accidentally select that. And I'll double click away from the artwork to exit isolation mode. Now we'll apply a linear gradient to a stroke and create a kind of interesting three-dimensional effect. And we're going to do that first by selecting the red stroke of this shape. And in the Tools panel, I want to make sure that the stroke icon is forward, because that's what we're applying the gradient to. And then I'll just click the gradient, default gradient there at the bottom of the Tools panel. So it filled the gradient on the stroke there. And if you notice I'll zoom in here so we can see what's happening better and see the changes better. And if you notice in the gradient panel, we have different options for how the stroke, or how we apply the gradient to the stroke. And again, make sure that stroke icon is forward. I'm going to choose Apply Gradient Across the Stroke. And we can see that it creates a kind of, it's the beginning of our three-dimensional effect, but we're going to add some more stops to our gradient. So I'll position the pointer below the gradient slider between the two color stops, and when I see a plus sign appear, I just click and that will add another stop. And I'll double click that new stop and I'll choose the swatch named BG 10%, and I can just press the escape key to hide that swatches panel. And I want to make sure that the color stop that I just added is right in the middle at 50%, and I'll do that in the gradient panel. Now I want to copy one of those gradient stops, so I'll hold down the Option on the Mac or the Alt key on the window, click and drag the color stop on the far right to the left, and I'll release the mouse button when I see approximately 25% in the location value. And now you can see how it's really changing the look of this stroke to create an even more three-dimensional look to it. Now I want to remove the leftmost gradient stop, and all I have to do is click on it and drag down, and that removes it from the gradient slider. And now you can see how we've really created a very three-dimensional looking frame for our picture with just doing a gradient on the stroke. And it's really very effective at doing that.